Okay, let me just take the chalk. Yeah, okay, so thank you very much, Ophelia, for the nice presentation, and thanks a lot, Ophelia, Leligio, and all the other organizers for inviting me to deliver these lectures. And okay, thanks to all of you for being here. I hope you will find interesting these lectures. So as Eligio said, I'm going to discuss, to present 5 lectures on neutrinos in physics, astrophysics, and cosmology. Okay, I'm using this because I will share a few slides, but mostly I will try to do the development in the Blackboard. So this is the outline of the course. So today I plan to start with a historical introduction on the discovery of neutrinos and the different experimental aspects of importance for neutrinos, and the properties of neutrinos in the Standard Model, their interactions, their masses, etc. Then tomorrow, I will discuss neutrino oscillations, the formalism in vacuum and in matter. The third lecture, I plan to discuss the three-neutrino phenomenology, so neutrino oscillations, taking into account three-neutrino effects. Then for the fourth lecture, I will discuss different aspects of neutrino physics beyond the Standard Model. So I will discuss several options that are on the table and what is the status of the experimental searches on this physics beyond the Standard Model. And finally, on the lecture number 5, I will discuss which is the current status for the neutrino mass searches. I will describe briefly also the results on neutrino-less double beta decay experiments. And I will discuss how is the impact of neutrinos in astrophysics and cosmology. Okay? So I mean, the organizer told me that you are more or less, most of you are from the first year of the PhD. Okay, but there are also some master students. A few master students. Okay, of the PhD. Okay, so I don't know how is the format, but for me, you feel free to ask me, to interrupt me and ask questions. Okay, so let's start with very basic things. What is a neutrino? So I guess by now, most of you know what is a neutrino. Okay, a neutrino is a spin-wise half particle, ¿vale? A fermion, ¿vale? Okay. What else? It is a neutral particle. It carries no electric charge. It's almost a massless particle. We'll discuss this in more detail. Almost, because as we will see today, the Standard Model says it is massless, but we know already that there are evidences that it is not the case. Okay, and we know that they come in 3 different flavors. Okay, this is what we know about neutrinos. You have there the chart with the elementary particles of the Standard Model, when you can see where the neutrinos fit. Okay, but what else we know? We know that are very abundant particles. Okay, in the plot to the left, you have this. Okay, let me see if this works. Okay, cannot. Okay, there. In this plot here, you can see the number of particles in the universe, the number of particles per centimeter squared. So you can see that neutrinos are the second most abundant particles, just a few after photons. And neutrinos are much more common than hydrogen atoms. Okay, you can see that there are many, many orders of magnitude between photons, neutrinos, and all the other particles. And we know this, are very abundant, and we know is that, for instance, now every second you are traversed by 400 times 10 to the 12th neutrinos from the sun every second, okay? We also know that we get 50 times to the 9 neutrinos from the natural radioactivity of the Earth. Also, we get very large number of neutrinos coming from power plants of the order of 10 to the 10. And even our body emits neutrinos as well. So you can now see that they are really, really abundant in the universe. Okay? So where do they come from? So they come from different sources. So I mentioned already a few. For instance, they come from nuclear reactors, okay? The nuclear reactors that produce the electricity we use at home, that they produce these neutrinos. Also, they can be produced in particle accelerators. Okay, when we collide protons and we fire protons against a target, then we can produce neutrinos. Also, in the Earth atmosphere, as a result of the interaction of the cosmic rays with the nuclei in the atmosphere, atmospheric neutrinos are produced. As I mentioned here also, the natural radioactivity of the Earth, where the crust of the Earth contains thorium, uranium, it produces neutrinos. The sun, that is one of the most powerful source of neutrinos. Also supernova. When a star dies in the last periods of its life, and if it ends its life as a supernova explosion, it emits neutrinos. So far, we have been lucky enough to detect neutrinos only from one supernova, but the detectors are prepared to, if any supernova explosion will happen in the future, then we will be ready to detect more neutrinos. Also, neutrinos can be emitted from accelerators in astrophysical sources. And now we have already measured these events. As I will mention probably the last day, IceCube, the experiment IceCube has measured many of these very high energetic neutrino events. And also recently, perhaps you heard, the ChemTrinet experiment reported the observation of a very extremely high energy neutrino event. Still, the origin is not known. And finally, there are another source of neutrinos is the Big Bang. In the early universe, there were produced many, many neutrinos. The thing is that the energy of those neutrinos is so small that it's very hard to detect them. So far, we only have indirect evidence of the presence of those neutrinos. So you have a red tick because all these sources, we have measured all these neutrinos. In the case of the cosmogenic neutrinos, we have only measured, the cosmological, sorry, we have measured only through the indirect evidence. Okay, so this is about where they are coming. Then we have also here a plot about the energy spectrum of these neutrinos. So there you can see that the different neutrinos from the different sources span over a very wide energy range, starting from these very low energetic neutrinos I was mentioning just now, the cosmological neutrinos produced at the early universe. So there is this flux for these cosmological neutrinos. Going to the KeV, MEV region, we find the spectrum of the neutrinos produced in the sun and also the neutrinos produced in a supernova burst as the 1987A. Also, the reactor antineutrinos, their energy lies around the MEV. And there is also the background from the supernova remnants that is expected to be there also in this MEV region. So going up in the intermediate region, we find the atmospheric neutrinos here in green, the low energy part of the atmospheric neutrinos that also arrives to the TeV region. And then in the highest energetic part, we find the neutrinos from this accelerator AGNs, astrophysical sources that mentioned, that has been measured in IceCube. And the cosmogenic neutrinos are the highest energy neutrinos produced after the interaction of protons, cosmic rays, with the photons of the cosmic microwave background. That in principle, perhaps it is one of the possible sources for this very high energetic neutrino observed in ChemTrinet. Okay? Okay, so then I start with this very general picture. What is very basically a neutrino, where it comes from, where are the energies. Now let's do a little bit of history and see how we arrived to the idea of the neutrino and how it was discovered. Okay, so everything started with the neutrino in the 30s, okay? In the 30s, there was these experiments studying beta decay of nuclei. So you have there a beta decay of a nuclei. And then these experiments were carried out by many people. I put here some examples. Chadwick, for instance, or Lise Meitner and Otto Hahn were conducting these experiments. And then they were measuring the spectrum of the electron neutrinos produced in the beta decays, in the radioactive decay of a nuclei. And the thing that was very puzzling is that if it was really like it is printed here, it was a decay to two particles. And if you know you have studied kinematics, a decay to two particles, how the energy is distributed is very easy to know. So with this kind of process, one would expect a fixed expected electron energy for the electron. Okay, so one should expect only electron have a fixed value. But what was observed was that it is not the case. It was not the case. But the electrons were getting a spectrum of energies. They were getting at the maximum this energy, this fixed point, but they were allowed also to have lower energies. Okay, and this was very hard to understand. It was not possible to understand at that moment. Imagine that even Niels Bohr was even considering the possibility of that perhaps the energy was not conserved in the process. That maybe the energy was conserved at the general level, but perhaps at the microscopical level, it was not conserved. Just trying to understand what was going there, why the energy of the electron was not following the theoretical calculations. Okay, and then there was the proposal by Niels Bohr, but there was another proposal by Pauli. Wolfgang Pauli, he proposed that if, in addition to the electron, there was another particle emitted in this decay, then we will have a decay to three particles. And then instead of having unexpected energy for the two-body decay, it was predicted that the energy of the electron will follow a spectrum. Okay, and then he did this proposal in this very famous letter. I guess you have already, many of you have already seen it, that he sent the letter to Lise Meitner to be read in a conference. It was going on in Tübingen, where he was not able to attend, where he was proposing to their colleagues that perhaps there will be a new particle, and the new particle should have several properties. This new particle should be neutral, okay, in order to have a conservation of the electric charge, should interact very weak with matter, weakly interacting, because otherwise somebody would have seen it, and it was not seen. What else? It would be very light, with a mass similar or smaller than the mass of the electron, in order to explain the spectrum of the observed energies of the electron. Okay? So this was his proposal. And then he proposed, indeed, he proposed the name, or it was proposed the name neutron, okay, as a neutral particle. The thing is that in 1932, Chadwick discovered the neutron. I mean, he discovered a neutral particle with mass around of the same order of the mass of the proton. For sure, this particle discovered by Chadwick could not be the particle proposed by Pauli. And this is why it was used, the new name for this particle. It seems it was proposed by Enrico Fermi or somebody in his team. And then they name it, this particle, neutrino, for a small neutron in Italian. Okay? Okay. So, this is the particle that proposed Pauli. It was for the first time a particle that was not included, that was not part of ordinary matter. And as he said, it had to be very weakly interacting and therefore very, very hard to detect. And then it is famous that Pauli said this sentence here, I have done something very bad today, proposing a particle that cannot be detected. This is something that a theory should not do, okay? Proposing this particle that could not be detected. Okay, then once the proposal of the neutrino is on the market, then if once wants to do some calculations, you need a theory behind. And then we have the contribution of Enrico Fermi that was mentioned before, that he arrived with a proposal for the theory of weak interactions. I can use this one here. Okay. So in order to explain this, the beta decay, that it was essentially can be considered as the decay of the neutron, a decay into a proton, electron, and antineutrino. Then he proposed, in analogy with the Lagrangian of quantum electrodynamics, he proposed the Lagrangian there, a Lagrangian for this beta decay, okay, where he has some interaction constant that it was called Fermi constant, and then with the fields of the proton, I mean, you have also the equation there. So he used the same structure of the QED interaction to propose a Lagrangian that was describing this process of the beta decay. Okay, this was his proposal. And yeah, and one important thing, I mean, with this would be the Feynman diagram of this decay. And one important thing is that once it is said that when Fermi sent this paper with this proposal to be published, I think it was Nature, they rejected the paper saying it was too speculative and with little interest. Okay, so the paper was not accepted because of that. So you can imagine. And as I said before, so the new name of the neutrino, it seems it was put by him or somebody in his team. Okay, so once there was a theory behind, there was a Lagrangian, and with a Lagrangian, physicists, we can do calculations. So with this Lagrangian, one could start thinking why we have not seen the neutrino before, and try to calculate which is the cross-section to detect this neutrino, and see if this explains how it has to be detected and how difficult it's going to be to detect it. And then using this theory, the theory of Enrico Fermi, in 1934, Hans Bethe and Rudolf Peierls, they used Fermi theory to calculate the cross-section of this process, of the process above. So he calculated the cross-section for the process antineutrino proton, positron, neutron, what we call inverse beta decay. Okay? And with this theory, they obtained the following formula. So they had that this had a dependence on the half-life of the neutron, the mass of the electron, and a space factor, and the energy in the electron, and the momentum of the electron. So this was more or less the expression they found. As I said, this is a phase factor, and this tau n is the half-life of the neutron. Okay, so putting some numbers there, you can see that this cross-section was of the order of 10 to the minus 43 energy of the electron, momentum of the electron divided by MeV squared. That were their energies, more or less, in the process, and this factor with the half-life of the neutron, centimeters square. So this is the cross-section they got using Fermi theory. And then, I mean, we can compare, I don't know if you have this number in mind, but we can compare this number with, for instance, the cross-section for the process, electromagnetic process, photon-proton. And this is of the order of 10 to the minus 25 centimeters square. So you can see how smaller is in comparison. So then this was a reason that this was why the particle was not found before. It was so elusive with this very, very small cross-section. Okay, so in the tutorial this afternoon with Christoph, you are going to calculate, taking into account this cross-section of these kind of processes, you are going to calculate the mean free path, okay, of neutrinos in different media to try to get an idea of how difficult is detecting these neutrinos. So this will be done this afternoon. Okay, you will have to use these cross-sections. Okay? Okay. So, But then, once again, this is what Pauli said, impossible to detect, but maybe not. So you will also see in the tutorials that even though the cross-section is very small, when you calculate the number of events in an experiment, you need to convolute, to multiply several factors. So for instance, the flux of neutrinos in the source, of course, the cross-section, that is very small value, and the volume of the detector, the target material you use. Then we know that this factor is very small, according to this Fermi theory, is really small compared with other cross-sections, but we can play a little bit, increasing, for instance, neutrino flux, or the size of the detector, and then you will see, if you know already, it is not impossible, but you will see how difficult, what are the numbers of the fluxes and the size of the experiments we need in order to detect a few neutrino events. So this will be done this afternoon as well. Okay, there is a question so far? Okay. So then, there was the proposal, there was the Fermi theory trying to do some calculations to evaluate the numbers, and then there arrived the first proposals to detect the neutrino. Okay, the first proposal was in 1951. There were the two proposals by Fred Rines and Clyde Cowan in Los Alamos. And the first idea was to use a nuclear explosion, a bomb, to detect neutrinos. So, but by that time, there were several tests there in the US, and then they were planning to use one of these tests of the nuclear bombs to build like a cavern there close to the explosion, and then put there a detector, and then use the beginning of the explosion to detect neutrinos there. Okay, they had this idea because the number of neutrinos delivered in a nuclear explosion is huge. This was the pro of the experiment. There was a con. The con is that the process was very short in time, and also it was very complicated to control the background. Okay, and then finally they decided to give up on this idea and to go on a prototype on a reactor experiment. And then they proposed an experiment in the Hartford reactor in the Washington state in the US, that essentially they put a liquid scintillator detector with 300 liters, I think. Yeah, 300 liters of liquid scintillator, and just in front of a reactor experiment and try to discover electron neutrinos. They measured some neutrinos. The point is that they had very background, a lot of background, and then they were not able to determine precisely the observation of neutrinos. Then they move. I recommend, if you are interested on this kind of stories, I recommend you this document there from Los Alamos laboratory, where you can find all the stories around these experiments. So then, finally, the Rines-Cowan proposed this other experiment where they could control much better the background in not having the problems they got in Hanford. Okay, the idea here, instead of using liquid scintillator, they used 2 tanks with water plus cadmium chloride. The idea was to use the process of inverse beta decay I was discussing here. Okay, so having the reactor antineutrinos from the detector that would interact with the protons and produce neutrons and positrons. Sorry, positrons. Then the positron would be annihilated with electrons in the tank, producing 2 photons. And the neutron would be captured by cadmium, what you have there, that would produce photons. Then, detecting these 3 photons in coincidence with some delay, it was possible to know for sure that the process was initiated by an electron antineutrino. Okay? With this technique, they could control much better the background, and contrary to what happens with the Hanford experiment here, they could finally discover electron neutrino. Okay? And then you see there that, the discovery was in 1956. And then after the discovery, they sent a telegram to Pauli to explain him that they have finally detected the electron antineutrinos from the reactor, and that the cross-section estimated was in agreement with the theoretical calculations from the Fermi theory. Okay? So we have already the first neutrino, but then what if there is more than one? Rice y Cowan have observed this neutrino, but by then, in 1936, muon had been discovered in the cosmic rays. And then Bruno Pontecorvo, Italian scientist Bruno Pontecorvo, was wondering that since there was an electron neutrino associated with electron that was produced also together with electrons or positrons, perhaps there would be also another neutrino that was to be produced in together with muons. Okay, and then he proposed to do an experiment to check that. So he thought that this new neutrino could be a neutrino produced in accelerator. And then he just had this idea, and then there were several experiments trying to put this idea on work. And for instance, there was this experiment in the Brookhaven National Laboratory in the US. Sorry, I went too fast. By these people here, Lederman, Schwarz, and Steinbarger, where what they did is that they fired a proton beam against a target. In this, as a result of this interaction from the proton beam to the target, there was many pions were produced. Okay, and then leaving decay the pions, neutrinos were produced. Okay, so then the idea was to see if these neutrinos produced in the decayon of the pions were able to produce other particle that was not the electron. And it is what they saw. They saw that these neutrinos produced in this accelerator at the end were producing muons. Okay, and then it was the proof that there was a second neutrino in addition to the electron neutrino. Okay. So we have already two neutrinos, nu e, nu mu, but there is more than two neutrinos. So one thing to, okay, we are in, this year was, I don't have the year there, but this was, the discovery of the muon neutrino was in 62. We have 1956 for the electron neutrino. And then, I mean, we had to wait longer for the third neutrino, but already in 1978, the tau particle was discovered. And then there was, in the decay of the tau particle, there was also an imbalance of energy that was, it seems, an indication that also a neutrino was there, a third neutrino associated to the tau. But then the first results related to this new neutrino flavor came from LEP at CERN, where it was measured the invisible decay of the set. So in LEP, there was a measurement of this. It was a, it was an electron collider, electron-positron collider. So colliding electrons and positrons, they were producing sets. And then the set were decaying to several things. Among those, neutrinos. Okay? As you probably know, neutrinos are neutral particles, then we cannot detect. I will discuss this later as well. We cannot detect neutrinos, but we can detect them only once they interact with charged leptons. So we detect the charged leptons produced by them. So then the idea that was performed at CERN was to measure the invisible decay of set. What I mean by that? The invisible decay, the invisible width of the set could be calculated taking the decay width of the set, okay, and subtracting what it was visible. What was visible? So for instance, the decay width that set going to hadrons or the set going to charged leptons 3 times because the interaction is universal. Okay, if you take the decay width of the set and subtract all these things, what you get is the decay width of set to neutrinos. Okay? So they did this measurement, And let me check here if there is a place. So then the number of neutrinos should be equal to the invisible decay width of the set divided by the calculation of this decay in the standard model, the decay of set going to neutrino antineutrino. Okay? So do you follow how it was calculated? So then, with this calculation, they could measure the number of neutrinos according to lab results, and they got this value there. So it was consistent with 3. Okay? But still, this was not a discovery of the tau neutrino. And the discovery of the tau neutrino arrived with the DONUT experiment. So DONUT stands for Direct Observation of Neutrino Tau Detector. So there, the idea is that in that experiment, there was a proton beam that was fired also into a target. And then in this reaction, there were produced several particles, among them the DS charm meson that contains strange quarks. And this meson is not stable, it decays, and in its decay, it produces taus and other particles, and the taus will produce tau neutrinos. So this, you have it there. Then if you put a shielding in the middle of the beam, you can filter all the particles except the neutrinos, because the neutrinos with very low cross-section, they could traverse the shielding block. All the other particles will be absorbed, but the neutrinos will arrive. And then putting some emulsion target there, the idea is that once the neutrinos cross the shielding, they will produce, via charge current interaction, they will produce a tau, and the tau has to be detected. This is more or less the scheme of the experiment, okay? It was very tough to build, and at the end, the signature is the 1 millimeter track that the tau lives in this emulsion. And just to tell you that they were running for 3 years. Oh no, they were running for 5 months. And in 5 months, they collect data, but then it took them 3 years to analyze those data because they have many background, many things. So in 3 years, they filter, and they could obtain how many, you think? How many particles? So they measure 4 particle events. So they measure 4 taus. Okay, and these 4 taus were coming from the new taus produced before the shielding. And with this, there was the discovery of the 3rd neutrino. So we have already the 3 particles, nu e, nu mu, and nu tau. So this was in the 2000. In the 2000, DONUT collaboration. Okay? Good. So now I'm going back to the past again, because now I wanted to show you how many neutrinos there are, how they were discovered, but we go back to the theory, okay? We go back to the theory. We just left Fermi that proposed this Lagrangian to explain the beta decay, but then it was very successful, this theory of Fermi. In the end, the physicists wanted to extend this theory to other decays. And in order to do so, they had to work a little bit on the Lagrangian, okay? So then let's consider again Fermi. I will continue here. Okay, if you remember, we have seen that Fermi had proposed this Lagrangian for the beta decay, okay? I'm going to write it in this other way, GF over square 2, this current. Okay, instead of, I'm using this compact version, instead of the long version, where I've defined this current, the nucleon current, as we have seen before, the field of the proton, gamma, the field of the neutron, and the current associated to the leptons. That it was the field of electron and the field of the neutrino. So this is Fermi theory, right? Fermi theory for beta decay. But then, okay, the idea was to extend it and try to see the Lagrangian and all the possibilities. Then what happens is that in this Lagrangian, this these currents, they behave as vectors. They transform as vectors, okay, as vectors under Lorentz transformations. They are vectors under Lorentz transformation, this current, similar to what happens with the currents in the QED Lagrangian. But then you can build the Lagrangian just doing the product of the two vectors to get a scalar, because the Lagrangian should be a scalar, should be invariant. Then with two vectors, you can build a Lagrangian. This is fine. But then Gamow and Teller, in 1936, they realized that, okay, this is fine, but this is not the most general Lagrangian. You have other possibilities. You have other possibilities to build the scalars for a Lagrangian. And then they covered all the different possibilities that could happen. Okay. So they say that in addition of this vector-vector term, you may have your Lagrangian could be built for sure with this vector-vector term there, but you can use a scalar-scalar. You can build a scalar like that with the same fields, okay? With the same particle fields, you can build. This will be the scalar-scalar term. You have the vector-vector, that is the Fermi one. Okay, this is the vector-vector. But you may have other possibilities. You may have tensor-tensor. You may have axial-axial. You may have pseudo-scalar. So then you can write down all the terms you can have. I'm just using some coefficients that should be determined experimentally. So this is the tensor-tensor with the Pauli matrices. Okay, you have this axial-axial. And the terms with the product of the pseudo-scalars. Okay, so if you want to build the most general Lagrangian, you should not just take only the Fermi part, but you should try in principle all the possible combinations that allow you to build scalar term, okay? And then, of course, all the different currents will transform differently under Lorentz transformations. And this is the most general Lagrangian that was proposed by Gamow and Teller. But the thing is that this structure for the Lagrangian was proposed assuming a parity, that parity was conserved in weak interactions, okay? But by that time, in the 50s, there was the idea, there were some experimental results that were perhaps suggesting that parity was not conserved in weak interactions, okay? And then I'm going to review this thing. Okay, what was going on there in particle physics in the 50, 56 was that there was a puzzling situation because there were two mesons with very similar properties, same mass, same decay width, but they were having different decay modes with different parity, okay? It seems that it was the same particle, but the decay modes, it has two decay modes with different parities. So then, assuming parity was conserved in weak interactions, this could not be allowed to come from the same particle. So this is why, despite the properties of the particles were very, very similar, so they even got two different names. So this is what it was called the theta tau puzzle. Theta is not the theta, the lepton, okay, because by then it was not discovered. But the thing is that there was a particle, the one called theta, that was decaying to a pi plus, pi 0. And this other particle, or what it was supposed to be another particle, this tau plus, was decaying to 3 pions. Okay? Then, as I said, mass and half-life were similar, almost the same. But the thing is that the decay products here had parity +1, and this decay channel has parity -1. Then it was very puzzling situation because it seems the same particle, but with different decay modes. And then it was suggested in 1956 by the physicists Li and Yang. They suggested that perhaps it was the same particle, only that parity was not conserved in weak interactions, because by then it has been checked that parity was conserved in strong interactions, in electromagnetic interactions, but it was untested in weak interactions. So then they suggest the possibility that perhaps weak interactions were not conserving parity, okay? So they made the proposal, but the experiment was done by another team, was done in 1957 by the team led by Chien Seung Wu, okay? And then she prepared an experiment to really check the proposal of parity violation in weak interactions by Li and Yang. I think I have the slide here. Yes. So this is a scheme of this Wu experiment. So what she did is that in his team, in her team, she prepared nuclei of cobalt-60, and then they oriented the spins, the nuclear spins of the cobalt, using a magnetic field. Okay, so then this cobalt was unstable and was decaying to nickel and producing a nickel electron and electron antineutrino. Okay, so then this is the experiment. Okay, and in the experiment she was observing that the electron emission was mostly happening in the opposite direction of the magnetic field. So this is what she was observing. She had the cobalt nuclei oriented with a spin like that, and then the electrons were mostly emitted in the opposite direction. But if parity is conserved in weak interactions, then if you observe this process, you should observe also the parity symmetrical process. The parity symmetrical process, there you have also here in the top of the slide, you can see that this is what she was observing, okay? The electrons emitted opposite to the direction of the magnetic field. But if you transform this process by parity, you would expect also electrons being emitted in the same direction of the magnetic field. This is if parity is conserved. But then she observed that mostly almost all electrons were emitted in the opposite direction of the magnetic field. Yeah, so then what she was showing is that parity was not conserved. Both processes were not equally probable. Okay, and the thing, it was the reason behind that is that this process was not possible to happen because in this process here, that corresponds to the one here, you will emit the antineutrinos with the spin opposite to this momentum. And what we learned, and I will mention as well, is that this is not happening in nature. So at the end, the observed was that the electrons were emitted in the opposite direction of the magnetic field, but the reason behind is that what was not allowed was emitting antineutrinos in the opposite direction of the magnetic field. Okay? Only antineutrinos with their spin anti-parallel to the momentum could be emitted in the, parallel, only antineutrinos with the spin parallel to the momentum could be emitted in the process. So this was the proof that the parity weak interactions completely violate parity. Okay, so then after this result, Li and Yang got the Nobel Prize in physics, and Chien Seung Wu didn't. But later on, she got the Wolf Prize, the Wolf Medal. It was the first awarded, and okay. But it is recognized that also she has the merit. Li and Yang proposed the idea, but her team was the one doing the work, the experimental work. Okay, So then the idea is that with this experiment, what it was proved is that antineutrinos could not be emitted with the spin antiparallel to its momentum. It's very long to explain, so this is why we're going to define some properties to make this short in order to explain the results, okay? Okay, I would like to mention, if anyone is interested, after the BU experiment, there was another experiment performed by Goldhaber and collaborators, where they demonstrate similar thing. They demonstrate that electron neutrinos could only be emitted with a spin antiparallel to their momentum. So Wu discovered that these antineutrinos could not be emitted with a spin antiparallel, but in the Goldhaber experiment, it was shown that neutrinos always are emitted with a spin antiparallel to its momentum. Okay. So then, this is very complicated to say. So then, I'm going to discuss. I think I don't have the slide. Two properties to make this explanation shorter. I'm going to talk about helicity and chirality. So I guess some of you already have heard about this helicity and chirality. No? Okay. So they are two different properties that sometimes they are confused, but they are different. In a limit, they are equivalent, but not in general. So first, let us discuss about helicity. Helicity is the property that tells me if the spin of the particle is parallel or antiparallel to their momentum, okay? It is, essentially, it is described in that way. The spin, the scalar product of the spin and the momentum divided by the modulus of the momentum, okay? Essentially, it's the projection of the spin into the momentum, okay? And it could be +1 if they are parallel, or it could be -1 if they are antiparallel. So in that case, electron antineutrinos would be emitted with the helicity +1. Okay, here, helicity +1. Okay. So this is a quantity that it's Lorentz invariant only for massless particles. So you know why? Why is that? Why it is Lorentz invariance only for massless particles? Any idea? Okay, because if you do a boost, then what happens? Okay, you can change. Yeah, you don't change the spin, but you can change the momentum. Then, if the particle is not mass as the colleague says, then you can do a boost, and with the boost it changes the helicity. Then it is not Lorentz invariant. But if the particle is massless and it travels to the speed of light, then you cannot do this boost. You cannot change the helicity. So this is why it's invariant only for massless particles, and it is directly measurable. As it was measured in those experiments. You measure the spin, you can calculate, theoretically, you can calculate the direction of the spin, you measure the momentum, and then you can directly measure the helicity, okay? And then there is the other property is the chirality. The chirality is an asymmetry property. Okay, it is not directly measurable, but it is an asymmetry property. Is a chiral object is not equal to its mirror image. You have an object, you put it in the mirror, and then they are not the same as the hands. Our hands, you put one hand in the mirror, you get the other one, but then if you superimpose, they are not chiral because they don't have the same, they cannot be superimposed. Okay, this is an asymmetry property. And it cannot be measurable. It is Lorentz invariant. This one is Lorentz invariant, but not measurable. Okay? And then is what usually we call, when we talk about right-handed particles or left-handed particles, we talk about chirality, okay? About the chirality of the fields. And then if you have a field, you can build his left-handed part or right-handed part by leaving acting this projection, the projector over the field. Then you get that PL over psi, is the left-handed part, and PR over psi is the right-handed particle. Okay, this is what we call is synonymous of handedness. So it's left-handed or right-handed. Okay? Then, if particles are massless, the two properties coincide. If they are massless, then you have that it is Lorentz invariance, and then chirality is equal to helicity. Oops, I don't know what happens. I share the, okay. Okay, perhaps I need to share again. I think I need to share again. Somehow it stopped sharing. Maybe there is some time, and after some time, okay. So if particles are massless, then it's the same. Helicity is chirality. For massive particles, they are not the same. Then for massive particles, one may have, sorry. Okay. Maybe we can stop after I discuss this helicity. Once I finish, okay, thank you. I just finished with this thing. Okay, so then, if they are massless, they are equivalent. If they are massive, then they are not equivalent. And when we talk about left-handed particle, a left-handed particle that is massive will have mostly a component with helicity negative, but it will get a component with positive helicity. And the same for the right-handed particles. If a massive particle is right-handed, it mostly will have helicity +1, but there will be a component with helicity -1. Okay? And yes, that's it. And then if we have ultra-relativistic particles, then it will be essentially left-handed particles will be essentially helicity -1, and right-handed will be essentially helicity +1. Okay? So then let me just go back before we stop to this Lagrangian. We had the Lagrangian with the different terms. Gamow-Teller built these different possibilities, the most general Lagrangian. But this most general Lagrangian was built assuming parity conservation. And we have seen that parity is not conserved in weak interactions. Then you need to rethink, you need to go back to this Lagrangian and think that you can include terms that violate parity, because now they are allowed in weak interactions. So then, if you remember, we had this, the vector, we have this vector term in this there in the Fermi Lagrangian, and then you can now allow for atoms in the form vector plus axial. This term was not included before because it violated parity, but now you can. So then you can add a term to this Lagrangian there, and you can, instead of having this current, instead of having the current that will electronic current we have seen before, with the fields, the vector, with the fields of the electron and the fields of the neutrino, you can allow for this other current. Okay? So one can introduce this new term to the Lagrangian with this V minus A. Okay? So then this would be the structure of the electronic current, because then we know that only with this thing we make sure that only the left part of the neutrino participates. So in that way, we have that only this part participates in the Lagrangian, because we have seen experimentally that only the left part of the neutrinos participate with interactions. So in such a way, with this term, you make sure that only this term will have this electronic currents. Okay, so then one may have this general Lagrangian with the V minus A form that will have this field gamma nu GV minus GA gamma 5 C. Okay? So this will be the general form. Then one can split the components of the field and the left component and the right component after applying the projectors PL and PR. And with this, one can separate in the Lagrangian yes. Sorry? No, sorry, no, it is not, because it seems, this is the current, sorry, this is the current, you're right. This is not the Lagrangian, this is the current. Thank you. Yeah, this is the current. Okay, so with this, you can build the Lagrangian with these terms, and then you may see, okay. No, but here I have a problem. It's not. Yeah, maybe we'll stop and I will continue later, because now I don't find the point here. So let's stop for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So we continue with the electronic current. You remember we were just modifying the electronic current according to the first proposal by Fermi, introducing what we know afterwards about parity violation and about the participation only of left-handed component of neutrinos in the interaction. So there is the modified version of this current, and then we can write the fields decomposed in these left and right components, and then you can check that there will be 4 terms, okay? But then you can check yourselves that the cross terms where it appears psi and psi, they will be 0. So you can do the exercise. And then at the end, what we get is that the leptonic current will conserve also the chirality. We will have a term with the connecting the left-handed parts and another one connecting the right-handed parts, okay? So this is not happening with the mass term in the Lagrangian, because once we will now in some minutes we will start discussing the mass term in the Lagrangian, and then we will see that, for instance, the Lagrangian, the standard Dirac mass term for particles has this form. okay? And in that case, if we decompose again with the two components, you will see that there will be a term connecting the left and right-handed parts of the field. So in that case, you will get that what survives is essentially the cross terms. And this will be some impact in the building of the neutrino mass in the standard model. So this is for the currents. They don't mix chiralities, but the mass term mix the two chiralities, connects the two chiralities. Okay? So then let's move already to the standard model. Now that we have seen all this historical overview, so what we know about neutrinos? We know, well, in the standard model is based on this gauge symmetry, SU3, SU2, U1, and neutrinos are singlets of SU3, and are organized also in doublets, in lepton doublets. You have here the lepton doublets where neutrinos are organized with together with this corresponding charged lepton. Okay. Again, this L refers to the left-handed component because only the left-handed component of these fields participates in the weak interactions. But there are also, for instance, SU2 singlets for other particles, as for instance, for the charged leptons. There are right-handed components for electron, muon, and tau, but there are no, in the standard model, strictly speaking, in the standard model, there are no SU2 neutrino singlets. So new right, they don't appear because they are not needed in the standard model. Because since we have seen in the experiments, neutrinos are only interact only under this with this left-handed version, and antineutrinos only participate in weak interactions where being right-handed. So this is why there is no need of including these neutrino right-handed singlets in the standard model. Okay, so what about the interactions? So these are the neutrinos were first detected via charge current interactions, via, for instance, for inverse beta decay and the neutron decay, also in neutrino scattering. And in that case, these interactions were first described by Fermi with this 4 Fermi interaction with this intensity GF. Okay. Later, we know that what is going on is that there is an interchange of a W boson, okay, in the process. So you have this expanded, this G Fermi vertex. This is what is going on in the standard model. And the same for the Newey scattering. There's also an interchange of a W boson. And as you can see, you can notice that W couples two leptons in the same doublet. You remember the neutrinos and charged leptons are organized in this doublet, nu A with E, nu mu with mu, and so on. So this W only connect leptons which belong to the same doublet. So if I have here an electron with an electron neutrino, if I have an electron with electron neutrino, and muon with muon neutrino, okay? This is the basics of the charge currents, but also neutrinos interact via neutral currents. Okay, this was the discovery of the neutral currents in 1973 in the Gargamel chamber, bubble chamber, where they first observed this interaction of muon antineutrinos with nucleons, okay, producing these very nice pictures. And also they observed the interaction of muon antineutrinos with electrons. So here you have those historical images of this Gargamel bubble chamber. But what is going on behind these nice pictures is this process. These are these Feynman diagrams here. What is happening is that when going into detail into this vertex, what is going on is that the particles are interchanging a set boson. In that case, and also here, the interchange a set boson. Okay, and this was indeed the first evidence for the discovery of the set boson, the discovery of the neutral currents. Okay, so summarizing, these are the neutrino interactions in the standard model. So one might have this interaction between neutrino of a given flavor together with the same charged lepton flavor that belongs to the same doublet. In that case, they are connected via the W plus minus boson. And here, this is the Lagrangian for this with the same structure of the current as we have seen here. With the left, you remember this left components of the fields. And for the neutral currents, it connects neutrinos and antineutrinos of the same flavor, interchanging the Z boson. And this is the Lagrangian for this neutral current interaction. Okay, one important thing is that, as you can see, the interactions conserve total lepton number. Okay, this if we can assign lepton number we can assign lepton number to charged particles and neutrinos equal to 1, and lepton number to the antiparticles, so positively charged leptons and antineutrinos -1. So we can see that these weak interactions conserved lepton number, and also this is conserved, but also these interactions conserved the family independent lepton numbers, this L alpha, okay? If you have always the same flavors, what was I trying to say before. So you have always same flavor here, same flavor here. So the family lepton numbers, Le, L mu, L tau, is also conserved by weak interactions. Okay? So this is another way to see it. These weak interactions conserve flavor, so neutrinos are always produced together with their associated charged lepton. In a source, I will have together electrons with electron neutrinos, muon with muon neutrinos, or tau with tau neutrinos. In the standard model, I will never get this combination, mu e together with mu, for instance. Okay? It may appear in some extensions beyond the standard model, but not in the standard model. And since we know that we cannot see directly the neutrinos because they are neutral, but we detect the neutrinos through the effect of the charged lepton that is produced in combination with it. So then neutrinos are detected or produced always in combination with the associated charged lepton. For instance, here in the source, we see an electron. We know that it has been produced an electron neutrino. And in the detector, once we measure an electron, we know that it comes from an interaction of an electron neutrino. So either in source and production and detection, always they appear together with the associated charged lepton. And the same for the other flavors. Okay? Good. Another interaction that I would like to mention is the coherent elastic neutrino nucleus scattering. So besides the charged currents, this is a neutral current process, but it has some peculiarities that make it really interesting. So this process is a neutral current process, as I said, where neutrinos interchange a Z boson. And the thing is that once, if the energy, so the process, let me write you what will be the general version of the process. So when happens or when does not happen this coherent electron nucleus scattering, or also we call it for short sevens, okay? These sevens, because otherwise it's too long to use all these things. So the process happens with a neutrino interacts with a nucleon, okay? And it is an elastic interaction. But the thing is that the energies of the neutrinos are low enough such that their de Broglie wavelength is larger than the size, than the radius of the nucleus, then it cannot interact individually with the different nucleons, but it interacts collectively, coherently with all the nucleons together in the nuclei. This is the nice thing. So then you need energies, usually energies of the neutrino below 100 MeV. Okay, with these energies below the 100 MeV, so you will have the momentum will be smaller than 1 over the radius of the nucleus. Essentially, the de Broglie was what I said, the de Broglie long wave will be larger. You can see, then it cannot distinguish, let's say, the nucleus one by one, but it just see the nucleus as a whole. Then, of course, the same process, once you have different energies, then you have different regimes. For high energies, you have elastic incoherent, where there is an elastic collision, but with any individual nucleus in the nuclei. And if the energy is much, much larger, then you have an inelastic process, okay, where there is really a modification, or you can even eject one of the nucleons in the nucleus. So the nice thing is that this process is a standard model process, these sevens, and it was proposed in 1974 by Friedman, but it took very long to detect it. Indeed, it was detected in 2017, okay, after many, many years. And the thing is that in order to detect, one needs to measure the recoil of the nucleus after this process. And you can imagine if the energy of the neutrino is very low, the recoil of the nucleus, that is a heavy target, it will be very, very small. So you need really very precise experiments in order to measure the recoil energy of the nucleus. So this is why it took so long to measure it. Here you have when it appeared in Science, the publication of the first observation of this event in the Oak Ridge National Lab in the US. And what is the nice thing of this process? So the good thing is that the cross-section, usually we are used to have very small cross-sections with neutrinos. We have just seen it. In that case, the cross-section is enhanced by a factor n squared, with n being the number of neutrons in the nucleus. So then here you have a plot showing the cross sections. For instance, the red line here is the inverse beta decay, is the cross section that we calculated, is 10 to the minus 43 centimeters square. So this is a capture of neutrons, but this is in blue line is the sevens cross section. Is orders of magnitude larger than other cross sections. Okay. So there, I can write you down the expression for the cross section. So this is purely standard model. So then you have that this cross section of course you are dealing with nuclei, so you need to take into account the nuclear effects there, using some form factors for the nuclear part of the calculation. You have a kinetical term. And then there is a term with the vectorial charge. So this is essentially the value of the cross section there. As I told you, this is a nuclear form factor. These are kinematical effects, and this is where, let's say, the weak interactions are, because this current is calculated with the couplings of the protons for the number of protons plus the number of neutrons times the coupling of neutrons. And the thing is that it happens that this term is very small. So this is essentially GNN. So then you can see that the cross section goes like n squared. And this is the very important thing, that you get this enhancement. Then the cross section is that large that you can even have the possibility to build small experiments. Because usually, perhaps you already know, we will discuss the following days, usually for neutrinos, we need tons or 1 kilometer square of ice, 1 kilometer square of water, 50,000 tons of water. But here, with these experiments, with several kilograms of mass, you can build a detector. Indeed, the first detection of these sevens was performed with after a few kilograms of detector. And this is very, very powerful. And then I will discuss, sorry, again. I missed the connection. So then I will discuss probably, when I will discuss about BSM, that this opens a new window, because with these very small experiments, one can test for physics beyond the standard model with rather small experiments. That it was not, okay, no, I need to share again. Sorry. Okay. Okay. So then this is the form. I had the the cross-section there. There are a few terms, because here I only wrote down the vectorial part of the cross-section. There is also an axial part of the cross-section over there, but this contribution should be is small for most of the nuclei, because it cancels out for the nuclei with the even number of protons and neutrons. So usually this term is not very important, but with the vectorial term, you can play a lot. And using these sevens, you can study nuclear physics. You can study weak interactions encoded in this factor over there. So we will go back to these sevens, because using the results that it has been already observed in 3 experiments, in accelerator and with accelerator and reactor neutrinos, and it offers this possibility to test for new physics. Okay, so now let's move to, we have seen neutrino interactions in the standard model. Now let's talk about the masses, okay? So, in the standard model, the usual term to build fermion masses is the so-called Dirac mass term. That is the one I just wrote it before, and I deleted. Okay, this term there. So you have this term, and then you have the 2 chiralities, and then you have these 2 terms. Okay, so first of all, you cannot build this term from scratch in the standard model, because this term is not invariant under the gauge symmetries of the standard model, because you are combining a field in a doublet with a field in a singlet. So then this is not transformating well, so then it is not invariant, you cannot use it. However, you can use the Higgs mechanism to build a term like that. So then when we introduce the Higgs field, okay, and with the Higgs field, we convert this Dirac mass term, okay, we write like an interaction between the left field, right field, and this scalar Higgs field, okay? Then this behaves correctly under Lorentz invariance. This behaves correctly, and then after the spontaneous symmetry breaking of the standard model, once the Higgs gets above, you essentially obtain the term you had before. Okay, so you get the same term, but theoretically it's motivated and it's correct. Okay, so in that case, you can build is the way that you build fermion masses in the standard model through the Higgs mechanism. This is fine for most of the particles, but if you remember, there is no right-handed neutrino in the standard model. Okay, then you cannot build this term for neutrinos. Okay, so let's try another possibility. Another possibility is go for Majorana neutrino masses. You can say, okay, I don't have a right-handed field in the standard model, but I can build a right-handed field from what I have. From the left-handed field of the neutrino, by charge conjugation, I can build a Majorana, I can build a right-handed term. So this is the left-handed term. So applying charge conjugation, I can construct a right-handed term. Okay, and this was the mechanism proposed by Majorana, Ettore Majorana in the 30s. Okay, so if I have this thing, I already have the right-handed field I needed. So with this in mind, so you can check also that what it is usually said, that the Majorana neutrinos are their own antiparticles. Because if you get the field of the neutrino, okay, and you do the conjugation, then you get again the field of the neutrino. This is why it is said that the neutrino is its own antiparticle. Okay, so with this in mind, I can build a neutrino mass for Majorana neutrinos. Yes, and I can build this term here. But again, I have problems with the symmetries of the standard model, because this term here is not invariant under gauge invariance, because it has isospin equal to 1. So this cannot be built, okay? So I cannot build it either. So I tried Dirac, I tried Majorana, but they don't work. So what to do? So what is the mass of neutrinos in the standard model? So since in the standard model there are no right-handed neutrinos, I cannot build a Dirac mass term, okay? Since in the standard, because I can solve this problem here, including a Higgs triplet in the combination. If I include a Higgs triplet, the term is fine. But there is, in the standard model, there is only one Higgs doublet. There is no Higgs triplet. So I cannot build either the Majorana mass term, okay? And can I try with terms with higher dimension, higher than dimension 4? I can try, but then these terms will be not renormalizable. And if you don't want to get in problems, then you don't build terms that are not renormalizable, and then you don't get these other terms. So this is why we usually say that neutrinos are strictly massless in the standard model. Okay? But we know that these two guys that I will discuss probably tomorrow, Takaki Kajita and Arthur McDonald, got the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2015 because they discovered neutrino oscillations, and exactly as the Nobel Committee says, discovered neutrino oscillations, which shows that neutrinos have mass. So what to do? The standard model does not allow us to build neutrino mass, but we know neutrinos, at least two of the neutrinos have a mass. And we know not only that, but we know they have a mass, but in this mass should be much smaller than the mass of the other particles. We have, for instance, the mass of the electron here, and the mass of the neutron should be 1 million times smaller, at least, than the electron. So we really need to build a mass, and we need to explain why it is so small compared to the other masses. Okay, so then one needs to go back to what we have seen that does not work, and let's see if we can fix some of the problems. Okay? What about the Dirac neutrino mass term? We saw that you cannot build it because we don't have right-handed neutrinos in the standard model. But one can add a minimal extension of the standard model saying, okay, I don't need them, but I will add them. I will add these sterile, we call sterile neutrinos because they are singlets under all the gauge groups of the standard model. You can add this new term, and with this new term, you can build the Dirac mass term. So this is, we are doing like small extension of the standard model, adding these right-handed neutrinos that they are not needed and there is no way to check them, okay? So with this, one can build the mass, the Dirac mass term for the neutrinos, okay? As I said before, you cannot do it just directly because the term is not respecting the symmetries of the standard model, but you can do it through the Higgs mechanism. Then with the Higgs mechanism, the same idea would be, with the same mechanism, you will give mass to other particles and also neutrinos, okay? So then the point is that we know that the masses of neutrinos are very light, okay? Then the Yukawa coupling in this term of the mixing between the neutrinos and the Higgs should be very, very small, 10 to the minus 13, in order to explain the order of the masses of the neutrinos. And it is very, very small compared to the other Yukawas. For instance, to reproduce the mass of the electron, you need 10 to the minus 5. Okay? So it's 10 minutes, more or less. Okay. So here we can build the term, but also the naturalness of the mass could be a bit under doubt because of that. Okay. Another possibility is the minimal seesaw mechanism. In the minimal seesaw mechanism, we also need to add these new right-handed neutrinos that are not in the standard model. And what we do is that instead of having only the Dirac mass term, as we had before, here we allowed for the Dirac mass term, but also for a Majorana mass term for the new neutrinos. So we include the Dirac mass term here. This is the non-diagonal term that is mixing the left-handed with the right-handed fields, but also we allow for a Majorana mass term here of the new introduced NR neutrinos, okay? So this is the Lagrangian we have with the mixing of the two neutrinos. These neutrinos, since the matrix is not diagonal, they are not mass eigenstates. So if you want to reproduce the mass, you need to diagonalize the mass. You can diagonalize the mass with an assumption that MR is much larger than M Dirac. And under this assumption, you get these values for the two masses. So the values for the lightest states goes as M Dirac square over MR, and the mass of this heavy state goes as MR. So this is why it is called seesaw, because if you put a large enough, a heavy enough M2 particle, then naturally you get, since it's go in the denominator, naturally you get a very light M1 value. Okay? So I'm using just the slides because there is no time to go in more detail, but if you need to stop me, please, I will share these slides with you later. Okay? Okay, so I told you before that we were just focusing on terms of dimension 4 because of that were normalizable, but there is also the possibility of consider the Weinberg operator. The Weinberg operator is a dimension 5 operator that also generates neutrino masses. So this is essentially how it would be. You can see it like a 4-4 vertex particle with 2 Higgs and 2 leptons, okay? And after the spontaneous symmetry breaking, you will get a mass for the neutrinos. Okay? Once the Higgs get above, you will get this mass for the neutrinos. This would be a Majorana mass. Okay, this operator was proposed in Weinberg in this paper here, and the nice thing of this operator is that opens the possibility for lepton number violation because it violates lepton number in 2 units. So then it opens the possibility to very rich phenomenology like neutrino-less double beta decay. But also it has a new thing is that introduce a new physics scale. The mass introduce a new mass, okay, in order to regularize the dimensions of the coupling, and this mass is going to give phenomenology in physics beyond the standard model. Depending on where is the mass, I can have different models. If I consider the mass very large masses, I can do some realizations of the Weinberg operator with these high seesaw mass models. So these are, as I told you, these are just realization of this schematic. This is the schematic Weinberg operator, but you can put it in reality with interchanging different particles. So this is the difference between the 3 models. For instance, we have the type 1 seesaw, where there is the particle that's in the middle of the vertex is a right-handed singlet neutrino. In type 2, we have a scalar triplet, and in type 3, we have a fermion triplet. Of course, all of these particles don't belong to the standard model, so I'm talking already of extensions, but trying to explain the mass of the neutrinos. In all cases, you have here what will be the mass of the light neutrinos, and you can see that the lightness of the neutrino mass is guaranteed by introducing a very heavy particle. And R, this is the triplet, and there's the fermion triplet. If you consider a high enough, heavy enough particle here, you will get naturally light values for the neutrino mass. Okay, but there are also low energy realizations of the Weinberg operator, like for instance the inverse seesaw model or the linear seesaw model, where you need to introduce more content of particles. For instance, in the inverse seesaw model, you need to introduce 2 families of SU2 singlets, not only one as we have seen before. We need 2 families. And with these 2 families, you will get this very ugly Feynman diagram that with this you get the mass of the neutrinos. And the nice thing of these models is that you are not relying on the introduction of a very heavy particle. Okay, but the lightness of the mass of the neutrino comes from this coupling mu. This is the coupling that violates lepton number. Okay, in such a way that you are not introducing very heavy particles, because the problem of the very heavy particles is that could not be testable experimentally. If you introduce a right-handed neutrino of 10 to the 13 GeV, okay, it could be there, but you are not going to measure it ever. But with this kind of models, you can introduce new particles in the TeV scale that you can try to observe in the LHC, for instance, and still you get very light values for the neutrino masses. Okay, this is the good point of these seesaw models. Other models are the radiative models, okay, where in general in these models, what is extended is the scalar sector of the standard model. So in addition of the Higgs doublet, new scalars are introduced. And in that case, the smallness of the neutrino mass is guaranteed for the fact that the mass is generated via loops. You know that when you calculate a Feynman diagram with a loop, then it is suppressed because of the loop. So in that case, the neutrino mass will be suppressed by the fact that is calculated from a loop. Okay? If I'm going too fast, I will share this with you, okay? And then, yeah, I'm already on the final slide. We have seen these models. These all are extensions of the standard because it's clear that we need to extend the standard model. And another possibility is, okay, I will discuss, because with these models we have seen so far, with these CISO models, high-scale models or low-scale models, the thing is that we can explain the smallness of the neutrino mass, okay? Introducing very heavy particles or more content with violation of lepton number, but still we don't get, there is no explanation of why quark and lepton mixings and masses are so different, okay? Because if you compare the mixing angles of the quarks and the mixing angle of the neutrinos that we will see on Wednesday, we will see how to determine these values, but you can look and you can see they are very different. So here there is one angle that is relatively small and the other smaller. In the case of neutrinos, we have one that is almost maximal, and then one that is quite large, and another smaller. But the pattern is very different from quarks and from neutrinos. Also the masses, okay? This hierarchical pattern of the masses of the charged leptons and the masses of the quarks, there is no explanation. There is no real explanation on the standard model of why there is this process. And then one ingredient that can be added to the different models to explain neutrino masses could be adding extra symmetries to what we have. So in addition of the SU3, SUL2, and U1, one can consider that the particles have another symmetry, another group that is able to explain all these details. I'm not going to enter in more detail, but if anyone is interested, I can give you some references. And I was planning to stop here. So let me know if you have some question. Yes, sure. You can come. I have it, but not here, not in the slides. Yeah, but I can show you. Maybe I can share. I'm not sure if I have here the slide. No, maybe not. But I can show you later because I don't have it here in the keynote file. Yeah, but there are A4, and then there are symmetries, very, very complicated symmetries. So there's a plenty of fauna of different symmetries that can explain part of it. There was, for some time, A4 was very popular because it was, before it was measured the theta 1,3 mixing angle, there was the possibility that theta 1,3 for neutrinos was 0. And then with the A4 symmetry, there was a pattern that it was the 3 by maximal mixing that was predicting theta 2,3, 45 degrees, theta 1,2, 33 degrees, and theta 1,3, 0. And for some time, it was very popular because these are quite close. But once it was measured theta 1,3 at the reactor experiments, and it was not 0, then, yeah, still people is working and they're trying to add some modifications to explain the deviation from 0. But yeah, and then there are many other very complicated groups, symmetry groups. Yeah. You add a new symmetry, and then you need to assign some charges to the particles in order to prevent some term or to, yeah. Yes. Yes. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. What it is, they are used, they are also called scotogenic models. No, I don't know if you have heard this name, because usually with this kind of models, you get a candidate for dark matter. So usually one of these scalars could be a candidate, and then there is this connection. But now I'm not sure about this. There is this work. Yes. Yeah, yeah, probably there is a connection, and then you can do a prediction for this electromagnetic properties. Yeah, but I don't have any material for this.